Welcome to this presentation of Human Life International. HLI's contact information will be given at the end of this talk. So let's proceed immediately to our feature presentation.
Warning: in order to completely and accurately describe the subject matter, this presentation describes very graphic incidents of gruesome pro-choice violence, including murder and torture. It may not be appropriate for minors or for persons who are morally vulnerable to such material. You can find documentation on all of the incidents of pro-choice violence mentioned during Brian's talk at Human Life International's abortion violence website, www.abortionviolence.com.
Quick, right off the top of your head, tell me, what is the most violent social movement of modern times? If you're like most Americans, you answered that the most violent social movement is pro-life or anti-abortion. After all, aren't those the people who are always screaming outside reproductive health centers and waving those disgusting graphic signs? Aren't they the ones abusing women and pushing them around and forcing false and guilt-inducing information off on them? Haven't they killed dozens of abortion doctors? We hear a lot about anti-choice violence and an organized campaign of terror and intimidation against reproductive health centers. Most Americans, and indeed many people from other nations, perceive the struggle over abortion in the United States to be a vicious and brutal battle, with all the violence being committed by so-called fanatical anti-choicers. This is entirely due to the stupid actions of a handful of deranged individuals and the persistent and monolithic bias of the national media. The public perception of pro-lifers as violent crazies is fueled by the stereotyping perpetrated by virtually all so-called pro-choice organizations and the better-known abortionists, including third trimester abortionist Warren Hern, who makes a living committing the most hideous acts of violence. Hern says that
pro-lifers are, with few exceptions, vicious, irrational, absolutely ruthless, unscrupulous, pitiless, and driven by hatred. Every anti-abortion demonstrator must now be considered armed, dangerous, and a potential assassin until proven otherwise. The anti-abortion movement must be considered the source and spawning ground of a violent terrorist movement which threatens the social fabric and civil society of laws of the United States. The general atmosphere is one of survival. 25% of the abortion clinics have been bombed. This is a highly repressive totalitarian movement, similar to the brown shirts who broke windows in Jewish shops in Germany.
Why do pro-choicers like Hern stereotype pro-lifers so ruthlessly? Because everything the pro-choicers say is designed specifically to divert attention away from the bloody wholesale and very profitable slaughter of preborn babies. Not to mention, of course, that Hern is a multimillionaire who has made his fortune carving up viable preborn children. We've all heard the same tired old slogans. You can't legislate morality. Abortion should be a decision between a woman and her doctor. If you can't trust me with a choice, how can you trust me with a child? Pro-family, pro-child, pro-choice, every child a wanted child, and all the rest. The pro-choicers want you to think about anything but abortion. Now, what does the media have to do with the general public perception that pro-lifers are violent nutcases? Certainly there's a certain amount of justification for this attitude, since so-called pro-lifers have murdered 7 people and have seriously injured 10 others. But have you ever heard about a pro-choicer murdering a pro-lifer? Chances are you haven't, because when a pro-lifer gets killed, members of the national media consider it to be beneath their notice. To the national media, we are Untermenschen, non-persons, kind of like the preborn babies we defend. Do you remember hearing anything from the national news media when pro-choice activist Eileen Orstein-Janicek shot pro-life activist minister and radio talk show host Jerry Simon through his living room window? After killing Simon, she held police at bay with a pistol for 6 hours while yelling quotes from Anton LaVey's Satanic Bible. In 1994, a jury found her guilty of murder and sentenced her to life in prison. During her trial, she admitted that she had shot Simon to prove her love of Satan. And do you remember hearing anything when pro-choicer Byron Looper shot State Senator Tommy Burks in the head with a large caliber handgun? After he murdered Burks, Looper boasted that, "I did it, man, I did it. I killed that dude." Why didn't you hear about these murders? Because when a so-called pro-lifer goes on a rampage, it's big news to the media. Since the national and international media love conflict, They broadcast it all over the world, even when the abortion story has nothing to do with violence, such as the annual March for Life in Washington, D.C., or the availability of the RU46 abortion pill. But when a pro-choicer murders a pro-lifer or other people, we never hear a word. When a woman dies of a botched legal abortion, the media simply ignores her death as if she never existed. We can almost imagine the desk editor of a typical large newspaper handling two different stories relating to abortion violence. When a pro-life person commits murder, he may say,
"Oh my God, this is great. We're going to get a lot of new subscriptions out of this. Hey, all you people, drop everything you're doing and get over here. Matt, I want you to sketch an outline for a 5-part series on anti-choice violence. We're going to run it on the front page of Section 2 all next week. Get that to me ASAP. Maureen, you call the National Abortion Federation in NARAL right now and get me some juicy quotes. Something that'll make the public really weep. John, Steve, and Linda, you get over to the scene of the crime right away. Interview everybody who was or is on the scene and get me some real tearjerker quotes. You know, stuff about how noble and moral Dr. Jones was, how much he cared for women, and how he had to wear a bulletproof vest, even when he went to restaurants with his family. Let's downplay the lawsuits against him, his multi-million-dollar house, his collection of racehorses, and his convictions for beating his ex-wife, okay? I don't want to see any hint of that kind of thing in our story. Sam and Eileen, I want you to dig up everything you can on this anti-choice murderer. He's got to be one of those weirdo conservative Catholics or bizarro fundamentalists. Let's play the old rosary-praying hypocrite or Bible-beating nutcase card again. It works every time. People just love that stuff. Find photos of him if you can, and see if you can get one that really makes him look like a monster. Who's gonna care? Rick and Rosie, I want you to go over to the offices of every anti-choice group in town. Interview Right to Life, Joe Scheidler, every other guy in town. Get them to apologize for their violent rhetoric.
Now, when the same editor hears about a pro-choicer murdering a pro-lifer, we can almost hear him saying,
"You like working here, kid? Look, we have an unwritten rule at this paper. Now repeat after me. Dead anti-choicers are not news. Got it? Now go write me 100 words, and I'm going to stash it on C29. And oh, by the way, make sure that you do not mention that the killer was pro-choice, or that the victim was anti-choice. Are we clear on that? This is just another run-of-the-mill murder, with no political implications at all. Got it? Now get out of here."
The pro-abortion bias of the media isn't some right-wing paranoid fantasy. It has been repeatedly documented. The people who work for major media outlets are overwhelmingly pro-choice. They routinely portray pro-lifers as crazy ideologues and pro-choicers as calm and rational, gentle thinkers. They report only pro-life violence, never pro-choice violence. They ignore the gruesome details of abortion while portraying realistically the horrors of mangled bodies during wartime. And they ignore large pro-life events like the annual March for Life while making a media sensation over a gaggle of a dozen pro-choicers gathered on the steps of a county courthouse. Evidence that the media are for abortion has been accumulating for years. The Lichter-Rothman studies on media bias found that 95% of motion picture leaders identify themselves as pro-choice. 97% of television leaders describe themselves as pro-choice. And 90% of the news media leaders call themselves pro-choice. The Newspaper Guild, the nation's newspaper employees' union, adopted a resolution that reads, "The Newspaper Guild reaffirms a woman's fundamental constitutional right to make private and confidential decisions regarding reproduction. We oppose any re-examination of the court's decision and attempts to restrict those rights." When a pro-lifer gets into trouble, the media makes absolutely sure that everyone knows he's associated with the pro-life movement. But when an abortionist murders somebody, the media deliberately omit the fact that he or she performs abortions. As one example, John Baxter Hamilton choked and beat his wife, then smashed a hole in her skull with a rock, murdering her. Not a single article on the national press mentioned that he is Oklahoma City's most prominent abortionist. Dead abortionists are headline news for weeks or months, while violence committed by the same abortionist simply does not exist in the mind of the media. As one example, when James Kopp, murdered abortionist Barnett Slepian at his home in 1998, the national media headlined the story for days and often still writes long stories about him nearly a decade later. But when Slepian seriously injured a pro-lifer by beating him on the head, back, and arms with a baseball bat, not only did the news media completely ignore the attack, but the local pro-choice leaders actually supported him. Even pro-choicers have acknowledged what a good friend they have in the media. Suzanne Millsaps of NARAL Pro-Choice America said that the media has been our best friend in this fight. They claim objectivity, but I know they're all pro-choice. Whenever pro-choicers murder pro-lifers or other people, or commit other acts of violence, the national and international news services consider it to be beneath their notice. This means that you have to dig a little to find evidence of pro-choice violence. It also means that almost everyone is astonished when they're told that pro-choicers have committed more than 500 murders since 1966, and an incredible 269 murders just since the year 2000, and this does not include more than 350 fatal botched abortions. Here's some examples. In 1995, pro-choicer Laverne Ward murdered Deborah Evans and her 10-year-old daughter Samantha, then hacked the unborn child out of Deborah's body. He then abducted her 7-year-old son Joshua and stabbed him to death. A jury convicted Los Angeles abortionist Alice Ruiz Hanna of first-degree murder after she fatally botched an abortion on Angela Sanchez, who was a mother of 4. This abortionist tried to stuff Angela's body into the trunk of her car in full view of her children who were watching from the abortuary's waiting room. Peter Capazza raped his cousin, then forced her to have an abortion. To cover up his crimes, he literally skinned her alive, chopped up her body, and stuffed it into garbage bags. His former wife testified about how people in Tanzania often butcher their own livestock and are therefore skilled with the use of knives. Capazza was convicted of first-degree murder. In 2002, Matthew Wiedemann and his friend Ray Soto murdered 16-year-old Stephanie Nicole Burnett by stabbing her repeatedly and beating her to death with a heavy steel barbell because Wiedemann believed she was pregnant and she refused to have an abortion. The coroner said, "I think it's one of the most gruesome murders I've ever seen." Pro-choicer Joseph Manure demanded that his girlfriend Deanna Mitz have an abortion, but she refused. So he firebombed her home, and witnesses heard her screaming in agony and saw her engulfed in flames like a human torch. Her daughter, 3-year-old Kayla, was so badly burned in the fire that her bones fractured from the heat. United States District Attorney Leo Dillon said, "It's hard to imagine more anguish than Deanna and Kayla Mitz endured before they died." Menard was sentenced to life in prison for these murders. Pro-choicer Michael Baldwin's 15-year-old girlfriend Amanda was 4 months pregnant. He told her to get an abortion, but she refused. So he lured her into a secluded area and killed her by jamming a branch an inch in diameter down her throat with such force her tongue was torn out. Then he beat her and crushed her skull with a 30-pound rock. He pled guilty to first-degree murder. Sheriff John Anderson called the killing the most vicious I've seen in my 30 years in law enforcement. Documentation for all of these hideous murders and many more is on HLI's website at www.abortionviolence.com. The killing just goes on and on. Pro-choicers are yellow cowards, pure and simple. They only attack and kill those weaker than themselves, and we're not just talking about unborn babies here. Of the 880 people we know of who have been killed by pro-choicers, 97% of the victims have been women and children, and only 3% have been men. And any pro-lifer who has spent any time at all on the picket lines outside any abortion mill knows that the pro-choicers only physically attack women, the elderly, the handicapped, or children. The most pitiful deaths of all are the murders of pregnant mothers. As the abortion violence website shows, pro-choicers have raped, tortured, beaten, strangled, poisoned, stabbed, burned, murdered, and even buried alive pregnant women, many of them in their last trimester. It boggles the mind when you imagine some laughing pro-choice male gleefully torturing and then murdering a poor woman who's heavily pregnant and cannot defend herself. And it staggers the imagination to realize that no pro-choice group has ever denounced this kind of sickening violence. In fact, in several cases, pro-choice groups have even opposed charges being brought against the murderer for the killing of the preborn child. In one horrible case, pro-choicer Robert Hollis chased his screaming wife into a barn, shoved his hand into her uterus and tore the viable 7-month preborn baby right out of her womb. The American Civil Liberties Union sided with Hollis and wrote a friend of the court brief on his behalf, saying that all charges regarding the death of the baby should be dropped. The torture and murder of pregnant mothers by pro-choice men happens far more often than most people imagine. At least 3 studies by medical journals and state governments had shown that the most common cause of fatalities among pregnant women is murder, and statistics show that about 1/3 of these are due to pro-choice men who kill their wives or girlfriends simply because they're pregnant and refuse to get an abortion. If we use the results of these studies and basic information from the Census Bureau, we can calculate that at least 50 women are murdered in the United States each year simply because they refuse to get abortions. So where's the outrage by the National Organization for Women and other so-called pro-choice and feminist groups? Whatever happened to the right to choose having a child? As I have said, another reason most people think the pro-lifers are violent is that the pro-choice movement ruthlessly stereotypes us. When one person commits an act of violence, groups like the National Organization for Women or NOW and NARAL Pro-Choice America say that all pro-lifers are violent or potentially violent. The worst propagandist of all is the National Abortion Federation, or NAF, the abortionist trade union. It keeps a tally of what it calls anti-choice violence and disruption on its website at www.prochoice.org. Let's take a look at the NAF's numbers on pro-life violence. As of this month, August 2006, the NAF claims that pro-lifers have committed a very impressive 122,300 incidents of violence and disruption. Let's take a closer look at these statistics. To begin with, 86% of these incidents of violence and disruption were picketing. Maybe we should not be surprised that pro-choicers lump picketing in with violent acts, since they believe that their precious right to abortion is so sacrosanct it may not even be violated by people exercising their First Amendment rights. Another 9% of these incidents of violence were hate mail, harassing phone calls, and email or internet harassment. Now we know that many of these incidents are trivial indeed because pro-choicers are incurably paranoid and because they're what I call professional victims. Some of the activities NAF includes in this category are Christmas cards from pro-lifers, because there have been several incidents where pro-lifers have been arrested for sending such cards to abortion mills. Other categories that normal people would not consider deadly or extreme violence include clinic invasions or trespassing, vandalism, and stink bombs for a total of 3%. This means that 98% of the more than 122,000 incidents listed by the National Abortion Federation are not violence at all. Only about 2% of the NAF's numbers could rightly be called true violence, including the 7 murders we all know about. There were also 45 actual and attempted arsons and bombings at abortion mills during the time period 1996 to 1999. Now, according to the United States government's National Church Arson Task Force, there were 811 arsons of churches during the same 4-year period. So for every single abortion mill that was burned or bombed, 18 churches went up in flames. But what do you hear about more in the media? Incinerated churches or burning abortion mills? According to pro-choicers, abortion is such a basic human right that nobody can be allowed to even question it in public. As Faye Wattleton, former president of the Planned Parenthood Federation of America, said, "We need to remove the abortion issue forever from the legislative arena. We need a universal recognition that our civil liberties are off limits to partisan debate." To pro-aborts, then, there's no such thing as a legitimate pro-life activity. This means that in order to stamp out all pro-life opposition, pro-choicers must label all of our activities either violent or harmful in some way. To begin with, pro-choicers would love to prohibit all pro-life street activity because it interferes with their very profitable business. They say that pro-lifers must not peacefully block clinic doors to save preborn children from a terrible death because, as one of them said, this is committing direct violence against women. We may not picket because this is, as they call it, Cromwellian fanaticism. We can't sidewalk counsel because the women have already made up their minds and any interference will just cause them pain and distress. We must not even quietly pray in front of the clinics because, as they say, even this offends and hurts women. Pro-aborts would also like to ban all behind-the-scenes activities by pro-lifers. They say that we should not be allowed to offer real help to women through crisis pregnancy centers or CPCs, which NARAL calls fraudulent and deceptive clinics. These CPCs, of course, must never give women factual biological information on fetal development because this constitutes a propaganda tool for the anti-abortion position, as NARAL says. Adoption is off limits because, as Catholics for Free Choice says, it is misogynist and devastating. Pro-lifers must not try to enact any kinds of restrictions on abortion, even if they're massively supported by public opinion, because such activity is a violation of the wall of separation between church and state. We can't lobby Congress because this is partisanship. We can't organize because this is conspiracy. We can't educate the public because we're pushing anti-choice propaganda. We can't try to convince others to embrace our position through one-on-one dialogue because that is shoving our philosophy down other people's throats, and believe it or not, what one pro-choice group calls spiritual battering. Pro-life clergy may never mention abortion in their sermons or have a Sanctity of Life Sunday because this may cause frustration, guilt, and anger among so-called pro-choicers. Catholic bishops can't even exert any control over their own property by banning pro-choice speakers because the CFFC says this is controlling public practices. Pro-choice groups would even deny pro-lifers the right to express a belief that preborn children are human beings because, as they say, this encourages terrorism. In fact, some of these so-called pro-choice groups are so extreme that they say that the Catholic Church can't even refuse to donate money to groups it believes to promote abortion, such as UNICEF, because this is intimidation, strong-arm tactics, and a dirty little war against every good thing, as Catholics for Free Choice says. Finally, pro-choicers condemn even pro-life attempts to help women through the aftermath of abortion with programs such as Project Rachel, which they have labeled offensive and dumb. Would you believe that pro-choicers have even denounced pro-lifers who offer money and other aid to pregnant women to help them through and after their pregnancies because, as they say, this is questionable, manipulative, unethical, and dangerous? So pro-choicers not only refuse to offer real help to women in crisis pregnancy, they want to deny them help from any other source as well. This proves that the so-called pro-choicers hate motherhood and that they loathe children and families. There's only one choice they approve of, and that's abortion. So ignore your pro-choice relatives if they call you a violent nutcase. Don't be disturbed when your friends tell you to get involved in some other kind of activism. If your fellow churchgoers express concern that you're getting too radical, ask them why they're not radical. People like this think that anyone who does anything they don't like is a radical. Remember that this is how the devil works. He tries to distract you from doing what he doesn't want you to do. So get out there and do something for life. This is the best way to stick your thumb in the eye of the devil. Now, when we compare pro-choice and pro-life violence, we see a vivid contrast between the two. Pro-choice violence is directed against people, then pro-life violence is directed against things. Let's look at deadly and extreme crimes against persons, such as mass murder, serial murders, murder, manslaughter, infanticide, attempted murder and manslaughter, kidnapping, torture, rape, incest, violent sexual crimes against women and children, mayhem, and malicious wounding. Human Life International has documented 2,132 such crimes by pro-choicers. The National Abortion Federation claims just 27 such crimes by pro-lifers. In other words, for every act of extreme violence committed by a pro-lifer, there are 80 committed by pro-choicers. But which have you heard more about in the media? Pro-choice violence has always been bad, but it's rapidly getting worse. Pro-choicers have committed an incredible 269 murders and other killings in just the last 6 years, since 2000. 2005 was the bloodiest year, with pro-choicers murdering 77 people, including 28 pregnant women and their 28 wanted preborn babies, 2 baby boys, 1 little boy and 5 little girls, 4 men and 2 women, and 7 other wanted preborn babies. The pro-choicers almost matched this bloody slaughter in 2002 with 58 deaths, and in 2003 with 53 deaths. In fact, pro-choicers have averaged more murders per year since 1967, that's 39 years in a row, than so-called pro-lifers have in the history of the entire conflict over abortion. When's the last time you heard of a pro-lifer being accused of bribery, extortion, child pornography, child molestation, mass murder, serial killings, cannibalism? Pro-choicers are guilty of all of these, but you wouldn't know it from listening to the media. The documentation on the abortionviolence.com website shows that the pro-choicers like their victims weak and defenseless, just like the preborn children they kill in their abortion mills. Most of their physical attacks are extremely cowardly. Pro-choice men prefer to kick, punch, slap, and spit on small children, babies, women, and elderly adults. They only attack young adult pro-lifers when they're in mobs. Abortionists and pro-choice activists have violently attacked those who oppose them in literally hundreds of incidents. They've attacked pro-lifers with guns, cars, acid, hypodermic syringes, and baseball bats, and other pro-choicers have applauded and supported these actions. They have raped, forcibly aborted, and killed their patients. They've had a great time torturing and murdering their pregnant girlfriends and wives. They have bought second and third trimester abortions and then callously walked away to leave their victims to bleed to death. And then they've tried to justify their actions with sniveling and empty excuses. But then when an abortion mill burns, they loudly demand that all pro-lifers condemn the violence. We pro-lifers have to demand that these hypocritical pro-choicers apologize for and condemn the many acts of murderous violence committed by the members of their movement. When confronted with HLI's list of pro-choice violence, pro-choicers react the way they always react when faced with the unpleasant truth. They simply deny that the problem exists. They still claim that partial birth abortions don't exist. They still say that post-abortion syndrome is a myth. They still allege that abortion reduces child abuse. They still say that women want abortion to be available despite public opinion polls showing the opposite. And they still peddle a lie that thousands of women died of illegal abortion before Roe v. Wade. And now they're denying that there's such a thing as pro-choice violence. As one example, Joyce Arthur, president of Canada's Pro-Choice Action Network, or PCAN, claims that pro-choice violence is a myth, a pious fraud, and pathetic propaganda, as she calls it. On PCAN's website, Arthur callously dismisses as simple abortion complications the deaths of 360 women, including those cases where abortionists were found guilty of murder because they abandoned women to die. This shows how deeply she really cares for the lives and health of women. She just pretends they don't exist. Naturally, since she claims to be pro-choice, Arthur completely ignores the hundreds of murders committed by pro-choicers. She cheerfully chooses not to mention the thousands of sex crimes they've committed, the kidnappings, the arsons, the death threats and bomb threats, the tortures, the maiming, the molesting, even the serial killings, the mass murders, or cannibalism, and the pedophilia. She also conveniently neglects to mention fine upstanding abortionists like now imprisoned Brian Finkel, who sexually molested more than 100 women, abortionist Bruce Sterr, who was convicted of manslaughter after letting a patient bleed to death, John Baxter Hamilton, who was convicted of murder after beating his wife to death, and Alicia Ruiz Hanna, convicted of murder after killing Angela Sanchez and trying to stuff her dead body into the trunk of her car. In Arthur's tidy little fuzzy pink pro-choice universe, all women smile happily after their abortions, all anti-choicers are dirty little fanatics, and all abortionists are distinguished heroes incapable of anything but noble actions and thoughts. Dream on, Joycey. Soon you'll wake up to a world that you won't like at all. A pro-life world. In the entire history of the struggle over abortion in the United States, 7 pro-choice activists, including 3 abortionists, have been murdered. We've seen a huge torrent of manufactured grief and fear for the cameras among pro-choicers who've held massive rallies. They've written tens of thousands of pages of comically outraged prose condemning the violence. We also see boasting braggarts like abortionist and convicted serial sex molester Brian Finkel, widely publicizing the fact that he carried a pistol and wore a bulletproof vest for his protection. The United States Department of Justice has even established a national task force on violence against healthcare providers, which includes detailed tips on personal security. So just how much danger is an abortionist facing, especially when compared to other professions? According to the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics, 20 hairdressers were murdered on the job during the same time period that the pro-choicers were killed. Where are the rallies and the propaganda for the hairdressers? According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, there have also been 735 cashiers and sales counter clerks murdered on the job, 558 taxi drivers, 266 truck drivers, 155 janitors, 106 auto mechanics, and 78 bartenders murdered between 1993 and 2001. When was the last time you saw a bartender posing for the cameras with a bulletproof vest and a Glock? Why are federal marshals not out there protecting janitors and truck and taxi drivers? Why are there no heavily publicized task forces for them? Now, we can't honestly deny that a handful of so-called pro-lifers have committed murder. They've bombed and burned abortion mills and are guilty of physical assault. This behavior is inexcusable, but possibly inevitable when you consider the vast size of the pro-life movement. With more than 1 million active members, there's no practical way to screen out every person with violent thoughts or inclinations. Yet history shows us that the pro-life movement is by far the most peaceful social movement in the history of the world. Every other social movement is guilty of far greater death and destruction, including the civil rights movement, the unionization movement, the anti-apartheid movement, the gay rights movement, and of course the pro-choice movement. Let's take a look at perhaps the closest parallel to the pro-life movement, which is the animal rights and environmental movement. Both fight for the rights of other beings instead of for their own rights. But that is where the similarity ends. Many activists in the animal and earth rights movements not only resort to violence much more frequently than pro-lifers, they maintain websites boasting about the damage they cause. As one example, the Animal Liberation Front, or ALF, maintains a website that lists more than 1,000 violent actions it has committed, along with its sister organization, the Earth Liberation Front, or ELF. ALF and ELF boast of more than 100 acts of arson. The total damage they've caused with arson, window smashing, tire slashing, and paint bombing is in excess of $65 million. ELF has also committed other extreme violence that includes attempted mass murder. In 1996, it tried to burn the Detroit Ranger office in Oregon while it was full of people. Other major radical environmental organizations endorse and employ ecotage to disable and destroy land clearing and logging equipment. Such vandalism has caused tens of millions of dollars worth of damage. Earth First has even published books entitled Eco Defense, A Field Guide to Monkey Wrenching, and How to Sink Whalers, Drift Netters, and Other Environmentally Destructive Ships. Nobody protested because this was free speech. Now, I try to imagine the uproar that would happen if a pro-lifer published a book entitled How to Trash Abortion Clinics. Probably the most politically correct social movement of all time is the anti-apartheid movement. Its goals were noble, but it seemed to be insulated against all criticism, even when its leaders resorted to a widespread campaign of torture and murder to achieve their goals. Members of the South African National Congress, or ANC, the front name for the South African Communist Party, murdered hundreds of people during its campaign, most of whom were innocent bystanders. Nelson and Winnie Mandela endorsed the use of necklaces to keep opponents and critics quiet. ANC killers would hack a victim's arms off, then put an old tie around his neck, douse him with gasoline, and set him on fire. In just 3 months in 1986, the ANC and its friends necklaced and burned to death 172 of their opponents. Winnie Mandela boasted that together, hand in hand, with our boxes of matches and our necklaces, we will liberate this country. Many pro-choicers, including the Federation of Feminist Women's Health Centers chain of abortion mills, officially proclaimed their support of Winnie Mandela despite her grisly record. Even anti-apartheid clergymen preached extreme violence. Anglican Archbishop Desmond Tutu, winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, once said, "I am a socialist. I hate capitalism. One young man with a stone in his hand can achieve far more than I can with a dozen sermons. The only way to overthrow the government is with force. Imagine what would happen if only 30% of domestic servants would poison their employer's food. Is it not surprising that black resistance has not yet blown up a school bus with white children? They are the softest targets." Pro-choicers are cut from the same rotten bolt of cloth the world over. They are insanely violent and completely conscience-free. If anything, pro-aborts are even less civilized in the rest of the world than they are in North America. Let's look at just a few incidents of foreign pro-choice violence. There are many more listed at abortionviolence.com. In the most calculated and cold-blooded murder spree that Australia has ever seen, pro-choicer John Miles Sharp of Victoria murdered his 5 months pregnant wife Anna Maria by shooting her twice in the head with a spear gun. Then, in order to make it look as if his wife had left him for another man and had taken their 20-month-old daughter Gracie Marie with her, he murdered her with a spear gun as well. Then he chopped up the bodies of his pregnant wife and baby girl with a chainsaw and fed their body parts into a wood shredder, then bagged their remains and dumped them at a commercial waste site. He later confessed to the murders and told investigators that he'd actually taken little Gracie Maria to a scuba shop to purchase a spear gun that he would later use to murder her. English serial child sexual predator Ian Huntley was a pro-choicer with a taste for very young girls and violence. He raped at least 6 girls aged 12 to 18. One of his victims, Janine Oliver, described him as a sick, twisted, and demented person who definitely had a thing about school uniforms. Claire Evans had been married to Huntley, and he had demanded that she have an abortion. When she refused, he shoved her down a flight of stairs and savagely beat her until she miscarried. Huntley had also beaten up several other women he'd lived with. His career of terror finally ended when he raped and murdered schoolgirl Jody Jones. 2 little 10-year-old girls, Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, witnessed the assault, so in order to get rid of any evidence, he abducted both of these girls and murdered them as well. Then he cut off all of their clothes, dumped them in a ditch, and doused their bodies with gasoline and burned them. Finally, Huntley was jailed for life, and he'll spend the rest of his life in solitary confinement to prevent other convicts from trying to kill him. Joseph Mengele was a physician in charge of medical experimentation at the Nazis' notorious Auschwitz concentration camp. He stood next to the rail cars as they unloaded their pitiful groups of Untermenschen, whistling opera tunes as he selected the people who he performed his ghastly experiments on. He submerged these poor wretches in freezing water until they died in order to test human endurance in cold climates. He selected the prettiest women and girls and cut their breasts off, without expensive anesthesia, of course, for dissection and examination. He injected dye directly into the eyes of hundreds of people to see if he could make them blue in attempts to Aryanize them. After he experimented on these people, he would murder them himself or send them off to the gas chambers. After the war, Mengele, known as the Angel of Death, entered Argentina with a Red Cross passport and immediately set up shop as an abortionist. Pro-choicers in Nicaragua are even more irrational and violent than those in North America. A person from a so-called pro-choice group in Managua apparently had a crisis of conscience and leaked a document that outlined a pro-choice plot to wipe out bishops, priests, and laymen who were leading a 2001 Catholic campaign in the country against the legalization of abortion. As a result, Nicaraguan President Arnaldo Alemán ordered police to provide special protection for Cardinal Miguel Abando of Managua and several of the country's Catholic bishops who were targeted for extermination. The document indicated the assassination plot extended to religious and lay leaders of the pro-life movement in other Central American nations as well. Welsh pro-choicer Michael Baldwin was molesting his stepdaughter, 15-year-old Jenna Baldwin, and she was pregnant by him. Like child molesters all over the world, he tried to cover up his crimes with abortion. Jenna refused to have an abortion, so Baldwin beat her to death and buried her in a shallow grave. A jury found Baldwin guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Speaking of other countries, did you know that the father of the pro-choice movement once asked, "Who has a greater right to dispose of the fruit than she who carries it in her womb? To interfere with the usage a woman chooses to make of it is stupidity carried beyond all conceivable extreme." Who is this person? None other than Marquis de Sade, who was such a monster that his name is now synonymous with viciousness and cruelty. If you go to the abortionviolence.com website, you'll find an abortionist pop quiz to test your knowledge. You can find the answers to these and other questions. Which Chicago abortionist, labeled America's archfiend by the press, was America's first serial killer with between 50 and 200 murders committed? What New York City abortionist, subsequently known as Zorro to his staff, carved his initials on the abdomen of one of his patients with a scalpel because, as he said, "I thought I did such beautiful job, I thought I should sign it"? Which prominent El Paso abortionist and ardent admirer of Adolf Hitler became a professional wrestler named the Chinese Bandit to raise money on the side? What former Nazi SS officer put his wartime skills to use by becoming an abortionist for Kaiser Permanente in Ohio and Hawaii? Which world-famous American pro-choice feminist, a co-founder of the National Organization for Women, was caught by customs officials at an airport with a load of sadomasochistic magazines depicting women being tortured? What abortionist has sex with a patient just before aborting her, and when caught told a newspaper, "I believe that if a woman decides to have a termination, it should be done safely, legally, and with some dignity"? Which prominent Jackson, Mississippi abortionist, a prolific producer of child pornography, was a member of the International Diaper Pail Foundation, in which the members enjoy wearing diapers, defecating in the diapers, and smearing it all over their bodies? This famous Nazi, known as the Angel of Death at the Auschwitz concentration camp, killed thousands of people with his hideous medical experiments. After he escaped Germany, he moved to Argentina and set up shop as an abortionist. What is his name? What vocal Miami pro-choice activist murdered both of his college roommates with an axe and then called the killings justifiable homicide because the roommates had complained about his sloppiness? As a hint, this person also stabbed his abortionist mother in the neck with a steak knife. Finally, who is the father of the pro-choice movement? This man's name is now literally synonymous with viciousness and brutality. If you want to read about real violence, visit www.abortionviolence.com, which documents more than 7,000 incidents of pro-choice violence. The next time someone shows you a map or a graph of anti-choice violence and demands that you condemn it, tell him or her that the apology has to be mutual. If you're going to apologize for violence you're not involved in, he or she must also apologize. But don't hold your breath, because no so-called pro-choicer has ever apologized for their ultra-violent movement. If we set aside for the moment the 50 million preborn children slaughtered by pro-choicers for money and just talk about the born people they have killed, we find that pro-choice violence far exceeds that of so-called anti-choice violence by any measure. There have been 520 people killed by pro-choice murders, serial killings, mass murders, manslaughters, and infanticide. Add to this a total of 360 women killed by so-called safe and legal abortion, and you get a total of 880 born people and wanted preborn children killed by pro-choicers. In summary, then, if we count the murders of pro-choicers, they're far ahead of the pro-lifers by a score of 880 to 7. We have to remember that all pro-life activity is considered to be violent by the so-called pro-choicers. But please don't let this intimidate you, because this is just what they want. As one pro-choicer said, "I support the right of all pro-lifers to pray in their minds without making any audible sound." But as Pope John Paul II said, faith involves risk. You have to risk taking action, risk being persecuted, risk being unpopular. If you haven't taken action lately, if you haven't been persecuted, if you haven't taken an unpopular pro-life stand, and if people don't hate you for your pro-life activism, then you're doing something wrong, or even worse, you're not doing anything at all. Follow in the steps of our Lord Jesus Christ, who will protect you. St. Paul knew what it was like to be persecuted and outnumbered. He said, "Jesus said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in your weakness.' So I will all the more gladly boast of my weaknesses then, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong in him." And as James said, "Blessed is the man who endures trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life which God has promised to those who love him."
We hope you have enjoyed this presentation of Human Life International. For more information about HLI's mission, please see our website at www.hli.org. That's www.hli.org. Those listeners who wish to order more copies of this recording or other pro-life materials can call us at 1-800-549-LIFE. That's 1-800-549-LIFE.